Thank you, Boris. I'm very pleased to be here. This is the second event that I've spoken at in the context of the former West, so I'm very pleased to be invited back. And I'm also extremely pleased to be in Istanbul, which I think is precisely the right city for this Congress and this discussion that we're going to have over the next few days. I have only just changed my subtitle a tiny bit. It's no longer the slightly weary, once more on the horizon of expectations, a title given prior to writing the paper. It's now the slightly more definitive but also ironic, beyond the horizon of expectations. This change in title is intended to intimate not merely or indeed primarily what lies beyond some horizon, existent but out of sight. In particular, the unexpected, which is really what I want to talk about and think about. But it's really meant to refer to a surpassing of the concept of the horizon of expectations itself. Because the experience I had on rereading Kozelek's famous essay on space of experience and horizon of expectations in order to establish a kind of philosophical starting point for these reflections on the becoming historical of the phenomenological concept of horizon, which I think is what is philosophically at issue here. I was really struck quite forcefully, and more forcefully than previously, by the extent to which that essay and the concept now really seem to belong to another time. It's not merely problematic, I think, as a standpoint, as it has always been. I think it's in some sense becoming a barrier to thinking about the future. So I'm going to try and problematize the language of horizon. On the other hand, as my new subtitle, Beyond the Horizon of Expectations, indicates, it's very hard to talk about this without actually using the language of the horizon. That is to say, the language of the beyond. And this attests to a kind of residual ineluctability, or a kind of persistent relative validity of the idea of horizon. So I want to problematize the notion and talk about its limitations, but I also want to acknowledge its inevitability. So I'm not rejecting the notion. And I'm going to do two things. I want to talk about horizon of expectations as a historical category. This is, if you like, the philosophical part of the paper. And then I want to end with some somewhat gestural remarks to the more concrete historical situation with regard to those philosophical remarks about the fall of historical communism and the future of the so-called former West. Because it seemed a good idea at the outset, if we get to talk about horizon for 3 days here, to reflect a little bit on the history of the conceptual grammar of this term as it emerged in European philosophy in the early 20th century. So my first part is really a kind of brief philosophical history of the concept of horizon of expectation in 3 main stages, from Husserl via Heidegger to Kozelek. I'm then going to proceed via a critique of Kozelek to a critique of the deployment of the notion of horizon of expectation as a historical category. So the idea of this brief history is that it might help problematize horizon of expectation, and in particularly as a political category. As you'll see from the philosophical history, it doesn't begin as a political category. Now, a clue to some of the problems that I think infect the concept of horizon of expectation in its historical use can be found at the beginning in its philosophical source, which I take to be in Husserl, in the first book of Husserl's ideas pertaining to a pure phenomenology, which dates back to 1913, in a chapter awkwardly titled "The Positing That Belongs to the Natural Attitude and Its Exclusion." And you can tell from the title of the chapter that we're in for a grim time, linguistically, for a brief period. It's important, I think, to appreciate something of the philosophical specificity of this founding usage. And this, because this is the main philosophical context for the concept, And it comes up in Husserl's discussion of the intentional constitution of meaning in perception. So I'll give you the quote which kind of inaugurates the philosophical discourse of horizon in this 20th century sense. And it runs like this: what is perceived and what is more or less clearly co-present and determinate, or at least somewhat determinate, are penetrated and surrounded by an obscurely intended to horizon of indeterminate actuality. This is what we're talking about, an obscurely intended to horizon of indeterminate actuality. Husserl continues this passage and he says, again, this is the quotation: I can send rays of illuminative regard into this horizon with varying results. Determining present things obscure at first and then becoming alive, haul something out of me. A chain of these quasi-memories is linked together. The determinateness becomes wider and wider, perhaps so wide the connection is made with the field of actual perception as my central surroundings. In other words, what we would think is a narrow concept of experience. But generally, he says, the result is different. And this is the result: an empty mist of obscure indeterminateness, populated with intuitive possibilities or likelihoods. Only the form of the world, precisely as the world, is pre-delineated. Moreover, my indeterminate, there's not going to be too much of this, it's okay. My indeterminate surroundings are infinite. The misty and never fully determinable horizon is necessarily there. That's the end of the quote. So the horizon is always misty and never fully determinable. As he puts it slightly later on, in experience there always remains a horizon of determinable indeterminateness. And this is, in a way, this is the philosophical determination of the concept of horizon. Indeterminate but determinable indeterminateness. Now, to begin with then, for Husserl, a horizon is part of the positing that belongs to the natural attitude. In other words, it's part of pre-reflexive experience. It's something you can't avoid doing. It's the phenomenological version of what philosophically has been known since Kant as a boundary concept. That's to say, a concept which registers the limits of experience. But what's interesting about the phenomenological concept of horizon in the context of boundary concepts is that, unlike Kant's famously rigid conceptualization of limits and boundaries as borders, so that there's a kind of binary classification of all concepts that fall on one side of these borders, so that they're either judged as either legitimate or illegitimate by Kant's transcendental border police of self-reflecting reason. What's interesting about Husserl's conceptualization of the limit as a horizon, and this is what the function of horizons to be a limit, is it contains an essential indefiniteness that corresponds to the movement of determination. There's not a strict border, there's only a movement, a moving line within which the indeterminate becomes determinate, but never fully so. This is the crucial thing. Limit is not conceived as a border or a boundary. One reason that people seem to like the concept of horizon politically is because it escapes the spatial imaginary of the border, which was in a way installed by Kant in Western thought transcendentally, in order that the spatial imaginary of European nation states might turn out to be merely the actualization of some far more fundamental principle. The horizon, on the other hand, of course, doesn't posit anything on the other side. And this, I think, is something people are a little bit confused about. The horizon is phenomenologically immanent, but it's infinitely receding, right? It remains obscure and mist. You can never get any closer to the horizon. Okay? That's what you need to remember when you're if people are positing horizons as great ways of thinking about possibility. Horizons are things to which you never get any closer, however far you travel. As you can see, there's a grim political dimension to this, as well as a grim linguistic, philosophical dimension. So the concept of horizon transforms the spatial imaginary of the Kantian concept of a limit by placing the subject of knowledge within the field of a moving limit, instead of being transcendentally outside it. but it thereby also permanently holds the horizon at arm's length. And it does so in a way that I think is different from and contradicts the everyday connotation and metaphorical field of the notion of the horizon as something that promises something beyond the limit. Because this notion of a promise is, I think, associated with the idea of hope, and I would like to draw a strong philosophical distinction between the idea of hope and the idea of expectation. Hope is essentially a category, for me, of the post-Kantian philosophy of religion. Well, particularly hope is a category, at least in Kant, of moral or at the very best political theology. When Kant famously reduces philosophy to three questions in the Critique of Pure Reason, his three questions are, what may I know, what should I do, and what may I hope? If you then read on a little bit, it turns out that what may I hope is actually a shortened version of the real question, which is, if I do as I should, then what may I hope? Which is a slightly different question. As such, hope is not just a moral theological category, but it's also it's a part of what Kant called ideas, regulative ideas. Horizon, on the other hand, is part of a phenomenological problematic that attempts to an alternative approach to Kant's first question, which is the what may I know question. So as a spatial image, horizon points towards a beyond, but its phenomenological meaning is a confirmation of the finitude of the subject and of the subjective constitution of meaning that can never, in principle, itself break through the ultimate indeterminateness of the horizon. So the horizon sounds like an opening up, possibilizing concept, but if you examine it more closely, it turns out to be something of a prison. It's just the prison's moving. So the prisoner doesn't realize they're still in the prison. The concept of horizon of expectation, and metaphorically at least, I think the notion of horizon is indelibly associated with expectation, even when it refers to the past, derives from the simple combination of this misty notion of horizon with a similarly naively natural concept of expectation in Husserl as what he calls the looking forward aspect of what is made present. So it's one of three temporal horizons, the horizons of the present and of the past as well as of the future. Secondly, however, methodologically in Husserl, this notion of horizon is purified, it's transcendentalized, and it moves beyond the merely empirical description of the necessity of the horizon in a natural attitude and becomes a condition of possibility of experience. So there's a kind of absolutization, a transcendental absolutization of horizon in Husserl. And it's this transcendental phenomenological understanding of horizon that gets picked up by Heidegger and subjected to an ontological problematic on the very first page of Heidegger's 1927 Being and Time. And it's interesting that it appears there on the first page. It's the page that precedes the introduction to Being and Time. This is what I take to be the second stage in the development of the concept. And what we get told there by Heidegger is that the provisional aim of Being and Time is the interpretation of time as, quote, the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. So it's within the terms of the transcendental phenomenological concept of horizon that time comes in Heidegger and then after him pretty much to the rest of 20th century European philosophy to assert its priority over being. And this movement of the assertion of the priority of time over being is in a way the fundamental move of contemporary European philosophy, because it's the move which inserts the possibility of politics into the very structure of the subject, because it makes time, if you like, the ontological core of subjectivity. So horizon is no longer connected to temporality derivatively here as it is in Husserl, but it is fundamentally through the notion of a horizontal schema. I now have one quotation from Heidegger. Well, haven't got to it yet. I'll give you that one. This is the quotation from Heidegger. The existential temporal condition for the possibility of the world lies in the fact that temporality, as an ecstatical unity, that's to say a unity of the three different temporal modes, has something like a horizon, He says, ecstasies are not simply raptures in which one gets carried away. Rather, there belongs to each ecstasis, which is Heidegger's name for each temporal dimension, a whither to which one gets carried away. This whither of the ecstasis we call the horizontal schema. So horizon is immanent, ontologically immanent to existential temporality. This is the, if you like, the politicization of the concept of the subject via the concept of time. And in Heidegger's it's Heidegger's ontologized version, if you like, of Kant's schematism. In each of the three ecstasies, Heidegger continues, the ecstatical horizon is different. The horizon of temporality as a whole determines that whereupon existing entities are essentially disclosed. And then he says, with one's factical being there, I'm sorry about this language, with one's factical being there, a potentiality for being is in each case projected in the horizon of the future. So Heidegger, there's two basic temporal moves in Heidegger. One is to make time fundamental to being and hence to make time fundamental to the structure of the subject. And the second is to make the horizon of the future fundamental to time, or to prioritize it over the other two temporal ecstasies. And this is the point, if you like, that horizon begins to look like a dynamic political concept, a kind of dynamic, metaphysically political concept. So unlike the phenomenological horizon of expectations in Husserl, which is part of a subjective constitution of meaning, this existential horizon of the future is ontologically fundamental. And what's interesting is that earlier in the book, Heidegger prefigures this distinction between Husserl's horizon of expectation and his own horizon of the future, with a distinction between expectation and anticipation as two different ways of relating to possibility. And I just want to say something briefly about this because it bears on the question of horizon. There's a distinction here. I earlier said I want to distinguish hope as a theological category from expectation. Similarly, Heidegger wants to distinguish expectation from what he calls anticipation. Okay, I lied. There's a second quotation from Heidegger. It runs like this. To expect something possible is always to understand it and to have it with regard to whether and when and how it will actually be present at hand. Expecting is not just an occasional looking away from the possible to its possible actualization. Expectation is essentially waiting for that actualization. The waiting is important, and this bears on Walter Benjamin's criticism of phenomenology. Even in expecting, one leaps away from the possible and gets a foothold in the actual. Then he says, it's for its actuality that what is expected. By the very nature of expecting, the possible is drawn into the actual, arising out of the actual and returning to it. You can feel here, I think, in Heidegger's account of expectation, the shadow of Augustine's famous definition of expectation in Book 11 of his Confessions, where he describes expectation as the present time of future things, which is obviously a clearly theological concept of expectation. The present time of future things. In a way, that's still there in Husserl. In contrast to this theological dimension, Heidegger has another term for being towards a possibility as a possibility rather than an actualization, and that's anticipation. Now, it's because for Heidegger in being towards death, that death doesn't give us anything to be actualized. Nothing is actualized in death. Death is only as a pure possibility. That, according to Heidegger, the ontological distinctiveness of human existence, which for him is famously defined by the relation to death, is therefore equally defined by anticipation. It's because, if you like, you're defined by your relation to your death temporally, that your being is one of anticipation rather than expectation. So anticipation is the good term here, and expectation is the kind of bad theological and empirical term. Indeed, Heidegger goes on much later in the book to say that awaiting actualization, that's expectation, is characteristic of the inauthentic future. Expecting temporizes itself authentically, according to Heidegger, only as anticipation. So we can see Heidegger breaks with the theological presumptions of expectation, which continue to infect Husserl's whole conception of time consciousness, and particularly its more extended historical forms of expectation, which in the lectures on internal time consciousness, Husserl is quite explicit about as referring to being prophetic. In other words, within that discourse, expectation can only become historical by becoming prophetic, which is a kind of acknowledgement of the theological residue of the category. So this Heideggerian distinction between expectation and anticipation, I think, is helpful in thinking about the political implications of the historical application of the concept of a horizon of expectation, especially in the light of the crisis of the Enlightenment philosophy of history, which is really what's one of the things that's the deeper things lying behind the crisis in left political thinking of history. First, though, let me just quickly complete the narrative of this becoming historical of the phenomenological concept of horizon of expectation by turning to Kozelek. It's interesting that despite this emphasis on the horizon of the future, the concept of horizon of expectation, it plays absolutely no role in the chapter in Being and Time called Existential Ontological Exposition of the Problem of History. Heidegger expounds history without reference to the concept of horizon of expectation. Horizon of expectation acquires its place as a historical category within current discourses from Kozelek's use of it, and this is interesting, to specify the distinctiveness of modernity as a structure of historical experience within what Kozelek calls the generality of history as a whole. So it's something to do with the specific time consciousness of modernity that has, if you like, elevated the concept of expectation into some kind of politically valued or politically promising concept. In this respect, Kozelek is extending Husserl's concept by placing it into the context of his own work on the semantics of historical time, drawing on Gadamer's reiteration of the importance of the concept of horizon to phenomenology in truth and method. Of course, we should remember that for Gadamer is always only ever really looking backwards. In Gadamer, really, there's only really a horizon of tradition, and the horizon of expectation is really to do with your capacity to extend the horizon of tradition. So that's a kind of warning, in a way, of what might be lying underneath this supposedly prospective concept of horizon. Kozelek has a threefold thesis. First, and this is a Kozelek quotation, during modernity, the difference between experience and expectation has increasingly expanded. More precisely, he says, modernity is first understood as a new time only from the time that expectations have distanced themselves ever more from all previous experiences. So phenomenologically, Kozelek defines modernity by this gap or disjunction between your experience and expectation. You live in a world in which you expect things you have not experienced. Yeah. Second, this distancing of expectation from experience is constitutive not merely of modernity, but of history in general as a totality open towards a progressive future. Indeed, Kozelek has a kind of strong thesis, which is not only that the concept of history has the same content as the concept of progress, because both are manifestations of the time consciousness of modernity, but there's a sense in which, for Kozelek, and I think this is an interesting part of Kozelek, history in the collective singular is actually an effect of modernity, rather than the other way around. I think that's probably true. Third, this is the third claim, expectations of themselves produce new possibilities at the cost of passing reality. So expectation itself has a kind of productivity, irrespective of the prior likelihood of what is to be expected. This is the kind of bootstrapping effect of ideology on politics in some way. If enough people believe things that aren't the case strongly enough, they become the case, essentially. So the concept of horizon of expectations used by Kozelek as a way of formally unifying all of these concepts with the semantic history of which he's associated. Concepts like modernity, history, progress, revolution, the new, crisis, all these basic categories of historical thought. And in particular, he's insistent upon the epochal character of the shift from some kind of Christian doctrine of the final days with a kind of apocalyptic mode of historical expectation associated with it, to the hazards of what he calls an open but progressive future. The term progressive is a slippery one here because progressive is meant in a formal sense, not a politically contentful sense. However, it's not clear that Kozelek has reflected sufficiently here upon what I want to call the dialectic of the expected and the unexpected that is put into play in modernity, or upon the way in which the structure of historical time has in fact been affected by the historical development of capitalism and the experience of historical communism. And of course, in particular, for us now, has become more complicated by the passing of historical communism. In particular, Kozelek seems not to have detected the profound complicity between the phenomenological concept of horizon and historicism. Historicism being the philosophical form of what Benjamin, Heidegger, and Althusser alike all conceive as the ordinary understanding, for which we could say the ideological misrepresentation of history. Kozelek makes the distinction between experience and expectation his criterion of modernity as a form of historical time, but he also acknowledges that it's the extent to which expectations are exceeded rather than fulfilled that actually reorders the relationship between experience and expectation. Indeed, he admits only the unexpected has the power to surprise, and this surprise involves a new experience. The penetration of the horizon of expectations, this notion of penetration I want to concentrate on, is creative of new experiences. In other words, it's the concept of the new as the unexpected that transforms the relationship between expectation and experience. And it is thus in modernity, of course, the unexpected that we come to expect and to value. And of course, it's because we expect and value the unexpected that we so ludicrously overinvest in the expectations of contemporary art. Because contemporary art is the place we expect to find the unexpected. Right? That's the difficulty for contemporary artists, to live up to this expectation of the unexpected. In other words, in modernity, expectation is rendered dialectical and also abstract in a way that problematizes Husserl's depiction of it as if it's constrained by a horizon of determinable but never fully determinable indeterminateness. The expectation of the unexpected necessarily projects the horizon, if you like, beyond itself. Right? It projects what Kozelek, or rather his translator, is here calling the penetration of the horizon. As such, the unexpected seems much closer to what Heidegger called anticipatoriness. In other words, a relation to possibility, stripped of the determinate relation to a potential actuality, albeit here, nonetheless something objective in the sense that it's given by the structure of historical time itself, rather than simply being a kind of existential structure as it was for Heidegger. For Kozelek, then, the point is that however radically disjunctive the horizon of expectation may be from the space of experience, it can never be disjunctive enough to produce the unexpected. This is the political problem for me with the concept of expectation. The unexpected always comes from outside the phenomenological framework. The unexpected always comes from outside the horizon. Yet it's the unexpected that reorders the relations between the space of experience and the horizon of expectation to produce the disjuncture that Kozelek himself takes to define modernity as a form of historical time. So, and this is my main critical point, my claim would be the concept of horizon of expectation obscures the true structure of the problematic that it is used to articulate, namely modernity as the production of the new. And what's at stake in the relation between contemporary art and the fate of the left political tradition is that each is a different attempt to give a more determinate meaning to this concept of modernity as the production of the new. The production of the politically new and the production of the artistically new have obviously, throughout the course of the 20th century, been very closely allied, And there are deep, if you like, philosophical temporal reasons as to why that should be the case. The only phenomenological category adequate to Kozelek's account of the structure of modernity is the unexpectedness of the new. In contrast, the role of the concept of horizon in transcendentally regulating some kind of progressive determination of meaning aligns it with a kind of naturalized temporal continuity associated with historicism, within which the future time is projected as some kind of chronological continuity with the past. I take that to be the very opposite of a qualitatively temporalized history within which political acts can acquire historical meaning. Because in a way, that's what's at stake in the, if you like, the crisis of the concept of politics. Is it still possible for political acts to acquire historical meaning? In the unexpected, meaning is produced through dialectical negation, not by the further determination of the unexpected. So I want to oppose this model of progressive determination of the horizon with the notion of the dialectical negation of the expected. It's true, of course, this is why it gets dialectical, that we have to come to expect such negations. And of course, part of the problem of left political history is that revolution became established for a 200-year period after the French Revolution up to 1989 as itself a horizon of expectation. But insofar as expectation is of the genuinely unexpected, it cannot be horizontal in either Husserl or Heidegger's senses. Rather, theoretically, it must involve a certain readiness to subject the unexpected coming from the outside. And the outside here, by the outside, we must also, of course, psychoanalytically include the outside within, that is to say, the unconscious. Yeah? Because it's through the unconscious that the outside acts on individual subjects. We must be ready to subject this unexpected to historical interpretation and appropriation, i.e. traditionally conjunctural analysis. Practically, it involves a certain commitment to experimental practices of negation. Obviously, this is the connection. This is a strong connection between this concept of politics and art, the notion of the necessarily experimental practices of negation which will produce the unexpected. The political crisis of socialist revolution, on the other hand, stemmed precisely from its becoming part of the horizon of expectation. Paradigmatically, of course, in the progressivist form of the Second International, but in many other forms. We can see something of what is at stake here if we compare what a lot of people think of as two recent paradigmatic examples of the unexpectedness of a historical event. I'm talking, of course, about the collapse of historical communism in Eastern Europe. Nobody can write a book about it without declaring how completely unexpected it was. And the aerial attack on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, of course, equally paradigmatic of the unexpected. Where are we going? These are the two icons and kind of visual cliches of the world in which we live. We live, in a way, in a world defined by our confusion about the relationship between these two events and these two images in some way. So, to conclude on the fall of historical communism and the future of the former West, these two events, the collapse of historical communism, and I'm not just speaking, that's of course the image of the opening of the wall, but I'm talking about the collapse of historical communism as an event, not the punctual event of the wall, and the attack on the Twin Towers have very different temporalities, and they're very different kinds of event. They're events in a different sense. But I think they're both historical events in the same fundamental, if certainly no longer fashionable sense, a kind of classical sense of event, a kind of Aristotelian sense of event, by which an event is an occurrence that moves a narrative forward. Something becomes a historical event in a narrative sense by moving the narrative of history forward. Okay, most things that happen in history are not historical events. They don't move the narrative forward. Event, in other words, I take to be fundamentally a narrative category, and so the meaning of event changes as the range and complexity of types of possible narratives expands historically in the wake of literary and other modernisms. This is, if you like, the political importance of specific kinds of modernism is this expansion in the possibility of the narrative concept of event. Now, as I said, much has been made of the supposedly unexpected character of the collapse of historical communism. I'm dubious about this. Did the collapse of historical communism really penetrate the horizon of expectation governing the dominant Western political imaginaries? Or did it not, very precisely, determine their previously indeterminate but nonetheless determinable horizon? That is to say, did it not fulfill the long-held expectation of the unviable character of any non-capitalist historical road, thereby simultaneously extending and reinforcing the existing horizon? That particular horizon of expectation, I think, was simply and undoubtedly massively reinforced. What's actually meant by the unexpected character of the disintegration of historical communism derives rather from the inability to predict its occurrence at any particular historical chronological time, to see when and how it was going to happen, rather than that it was going to happen, which I have said was, I think, a kind of axiom, in a way, of the Western political imaginary. It was, if you like, it had always already collapsed. Nobody knew when or how it was going to collapse, but in some sense that doesn't affect its transcendental position as, in some sense, always already being about to happen from the standpoint of the construction of a capitalist concept of history. It's misleading then, I think, to conceive of the post-1989 era as being characterized by a generalized loss of horizon. Instead, I want to suggest it's characterized by the loss of two very particular historical horizons and the generalized reinstitution of a third horizon. The lost horizons are, of course, the horizons of communism and revolution, respectively. Communism is the horizon of historical communism, an empty mist of obscure indeterminatenesses populated with intuited possibilities or likelihoods, as Husserl would have put it, predelineating only the form of a world. I think that Husserlian notion really gives a very precise phenomenological account of the relationship between the idea of communism and the reality of historical communism. And secondly, revolution, similarly as a horizon of expectation within capitalist and colonial societies populated with intuited possibilities of non-capitalistic social forms, although the horizon of expectation there within advanced capitalist societies had in fact, I think, been dissolving since the end of the Second World War. And where it persisted, it increasingly functioned as a barrier to the qualitatively historically new. In other words, a barrier to revolution. The horizon of expectation of revolution, in some sense, negated the possibility of revolution. The horizon of expectation that has emerged victorious is, of course, that of the renewed development and planetary universalization of capital accumulation as the basis of social development. Long live and thrive capitalism, as you'll be familiar with this work probably, as Mona Vatamanu and Florin Tudor's banner says, appropriately enough. I took this photograph when it was exhibited at the 2009 Frieze Art Fair, which is precisely the right place for it to be. The inversion, it's been shown a lot though in the last year. Now this inversion of the 1926 Russian revolutionary banner, Long Live and Thrive Communism, which was then subsequently transmuted into the staple of Romanian state propaganda in the modified form of Long Live and Thrive Socialism, a kind of confession, nicely, I think, reduces the two opposed political imperatives here, namely communism and capitalism as imperatives, to a common political historical form. And I think one of the interesting political effects of the collapse of historical communism in Eastern Europe has been the revelation, the renewed revelation of capitalism as a kind of pure and raw ideological form. Its ideological character has become much more visible, ironically, as a consequence of the fall of historical communism rather than during the opposition. And that's because, in some sense, its ideological form was exhausted by the opposition. People didn't get a kind of direct relationship to it. Now, this common political form has the effect of emphasizing not only the raw ideological form of capitalism, but also, I think, the repetitive and monotonous stasis of its dynamic core as an economic ideology and a system of reproduction of social relations. However, this repetitive sameness at the heart of capitalism should not be mistaken for the absence of a horizon. Capitalism has a horizon, a historical horizon. It posits imminently its own historical horizon of endless accumulation. In Husserlian terms, ultimate indeterminateness as infinite progression. Politically coded in more or less purely economic terms is the progressive freedom of ever greater consumption. What was unexpected about the collapse of historical communism, or at least what was unexpected to the citizens of the former East European socialist states, was the ferocity of the capitalist revolution that would follow, which genuinely punctured the horizon of expectation of those involved in the transformation of Eastern Europe who sought some other kind of third way. But what about 9/11? And I just love this line of fire interpretation of 9/11 that Boris has. I think that's great. I think that's probably puts all other interpretations of 9/11 to shame. I think we should probably just put them aside. Well, 9/11 was obviously unexpected in the sense in which the collapse of historical communism, at least on my own analysis, was not, and not merely because it was a punctual event, because of course there were plenty of unexpected punctual events in the course of the collapse of historical communism. But it was also, I think, in a way, also more unexpected as the symbolic harbinger of a new religiously coded geopolitical antagonism, heralding a kind of return to civilizational discourses, which I think really has taken a lot of people on the left by surprise, the kind of ideological regression involved in those discourses. In this respect, it both punctured the initial Western horizon of expectation of the post-communist society, because in a sense the initial Western horizon of expectation for capitalism post-communism was that it would just now roll out. Yeah, everything would just roll out. So it punctured that horizon. It also, I think, darkened that horizon in the sense of rendering it still more misty and obscure. I mean, it's helped obscure the future of capitalism, which is a productive function. As such, that is, by rendering the form of the world less determinate, these events, I think, heightened expectation of the genuinely unexpected. Indeed, one might say that it instituted a certain possibilizing anticipatoriness, that it has laid the political aspect of the historical process more bare. In other words, it's rendered more visible the political dynamics of capitalist geopolitical expansion. At the level of the determination of that process, however, in its deeper structural respects, 9/11 was, of course, as it was intended to be, really merely emblematic of a particular secondary world historical antagonism. If one is within, as I believe we probably are all now, within a horizon of expectation internal to the future and the internal transformation of capitalism, there is another far less dramatic punctual event that occurred shortly after 9/11, wasn't particularly noticed as such in the West, but was obviously of far greater historical significance. And that was, of course, between the 8th and the 15th of November 2002, the 16th Congress of the Communist Party of China, in which a whole series of decisions were ratified regarding transformations of the law about private property and land, means of production, and the regulation and importation of capital. All of those ratifications were obviously of enormous determinate significance to the future of the world system in a way in which 9/11 simply is not. Indeed, that Congress opened up a new horizon of expectation within capitalism, But the possibilities that it contains, that is to say, in the genuine sense, the possibilities of the unexpected, are not horizontal, but if they are really to be possibilities, must remain, my argument is, counter-horizontal. For we will not reclaim a future qualitatively different from the present by reclaiming the idea of horizon, but rather by attempting to puncture it. In this respect, one can say in relation to art, at its best, contemporary art models experimental practices of negation that puncture horizons of expectation. Okay. The end.